Is the TCL Stylus 5G a good phone for mobile photography? Well, in this video, we're going to talk about it. Now, as of the recording of this video, you can only get this phone from T-Mobile or Metro by T-Mobile, but that being said, for what it is, it's a really great device. It's really reasonably priced with an MSRP under $300, and chances are you're probably going to get it for a lot less depending on whatever deals and promotions are going on at the time. And aside from just being really affordable, with stuff like a large 1080p display, great performance with a MediaTek Dimensity 700 processor, not to mention 5G connectivity, and some nice features like NFC and a stylus, the TCL Stylus 5G definitely has a lot to offer. But in this day and age, one thing pretty much everyone does a lot of with their smartphone is take pictures. So aside from all its great features and performance specs, does the TCL Stylus 5G really have a good enough camera setup for daily use? Well, we're about to find out. So to start, I'm going to give you a quick rundown of what cameras this phone has. In the front, we got a real nice looking hole punch design for the selfie camera. I've always been a big fan of this design. It looks real nice and modern, definitely a lot better than the water drop notches you see on a lot of phones in this price range. Now this camera is 13 megapixels, so on paper it is decently powerful, but keep in mind megapixel count really isn't everything. You could have a camera that's 32 megapixels for example, and still have it get beaten out by the 12 megapixel camera of the iPhone 13. As far as features go, it's pretty much just your standard selfie camera, nothing really special here. You got the standard beauty mode you see in pretty much every smartphone nowadays that doesn't really do a whole lot. Then you got your filters, flash, all that good stuff. But other than that, it's pretty much just a normal front-facing camera. But enough about the specs, let's take a look at what this camera can actually do. So here's a photo taken indoors in really good lighting. In my opinion, it does look a little hazy and the coloring is a little bit off. In the darker areas, it does look a little green and kind of discolored in general, which is not supposed to happen considering this phone does have HDR, so I'm not really sure what's going on there. Now, as far as the details go, it's not really bad per se, but it looks a little bit sharp and kind of cartoonish. And again, the colors do look a little weird. Now, that being said, is it the worst out there? Definitely not. I feel like in some situations, like for example, if you're using Snapchat, something where the quality isn't super important, then it's definitely acceptable. But if you're taking a photo for something like Instagram, for example, where it's something you really want to keep and you want it to actually look good, then this camera might not be the best for that. Now, I took this photo in my living room that has pretty questionable lighting. It's not really that great, definitely not meant for studio quality photos or anything like that. And keep in mind, so far in this video, I haven't used portrait mode yet. This is completely normal selfies. And that being said, again, I gotta say this photo just didn't really turn out that great. Now the details are pretty decent and the lighting is actually okay, but the colors are definitely really off. It looks like it has some sort of weird filter on it. And just to give you more of an idea of what it actually looks like, here's a photo taken with my iPhone 13. Now obviously I don't expect a $200 something mid-range phone to take quite as good pictures as an iPhone 13, but at the same time you can really see here the colors do look quite a bit off. So if you're taking lots of selfies in different types of lighting and that's something that's really important to you, definitely keep this in mind. Now out of curiosity, I took a picture in another room in terrible lighting, and surprisingly this picture doesn't look nearly as bad as I was expecting. Sure, there's a lot of contrast in the picture, and again there's that weird green haze, but then again remember this is the front facing camera of a mid-range phone, and phones in this price range tend to not have the greatest selfie cameras. Now finally, before we move on to the rest of the camera setup, here's a photo taken outside in direct sunlight and really good lighting. And now of course, compared to something like an iPhone 13 or a Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra, this is still not really a very good photo. Would I put this on my personal social media? No, I wouldn't. But at the same time, compared to the other photos and compared to lots of other mid-range phones in general, it does look pretty good. So in general, if you want something really professional grade, you are going to be disappointed. But for stuff like Snapchat, for example, where the quality isn't really that essential, then it will get the job done. And by the way, this photo, as you could probably tell, was taken with portrait mode, and I will say the background is blurred really cleanly, and overall portrait mode on this phone does work pretty well. Now moving on the back of the phone here, we got a quad camera setup with a 50 megapixel main camera, a 5 megapixel ultra-wide camera, a 2 megapixel macro camera, and a 2 megapixel depth sensing camera. So it's a pretty solid setup, and as far as features go, this phone has pretty much everything. Sure, there's no telephoto lens, but pretty much no mid-range phone these days has a telephoto lens, so most people probably aren't expecting that anyway. As far as the actual camera interface itself, it's pretty basic. I've definitely seen phones with a lot more, but I've also seen phones with a lot less, so it's really not bad. Besides the regular photo and video and stuff like that, we got portrait mode, Pro mode, pano, stop motion, slow-mo, light trace, macro mode, and of course high pixel. Now about high pixel, when you're using the camera on auto, you're not actually using the entire 50 megapixels of the camera, so the high pixel mode is actually going to use the full power of the camera so you can get slightly higher quality photos, but these photos are also going to take up a little bit more space. Now in general, that's one drawback of using high pixel mode, but in my experience it really hasn't been that much space, so it's not really that big a deal. Now taking a look at some regular photos I took with the main camera, contrary to what we saw in the front facing camera, these photos are actually really good. Now are they DSLR quality? Are they even going to match something like an iPhone 13 Pro Max or a Samsung Galaxy S22 Ultra? No, they won't, but for a mid-range phone, I do think it does a really good job. The details are sharp without being too much, the colors are bright and vivid, and the lighting looks pretty accurate. So overall, if you're doing stuff like vacation pictures, scenery stuff, or just general photos for social media, I do think the main camera of this phone will absolutely get the job done. Now that being said, as with, I want to say most smartphone cameras, even the rear camera doesn't really handle super high lighting that well. As you can see here in this sort of pre-sunset picture, it's really hazy and in general it just doesn't look good. Now that being said, if you do ever find yourself in this situation where you want to get a picture in super high lighting, there are plenty of tricks you can do when you're editing to fix this. And in general, this really isn't even a bad reflection on this camera at all. The main point here is to show you the limitations of this camera, so that way you won't get any unpleasant surprises when you get this phone and go to take photos. And now for something a lot of you have probably been waiting for, let's take a look at portrait mode. Portrait mode is a real popular feature when you're taking photos for social media, for example. I know personally for me, portrait photos are some of my favorite photos to take. They look real good, and with the right phone, they can make everything look super nice and professional. So here are some portrait photos taken with the TCL Stylus 5G. I'm definitely real happy with how these came out. The colors look great, the details are real nice and sharp, again without being over the top like the selfie camera was. And of course, the most significant part of any portrait mode photo is the background blur. And with these photos, the blur effect is really nice. Definitely not too crazy, but at the same time, it's still good enough to get the point across. A lot of the time with these lower end and mid-range phones, the blur can be way off. Sometimes the background doesn't even blur at all, and sometimes the blur is in the wrong place. All kinds of things can go wrong, but with this phone, it's pretty much perfect. So if you're taking lots of portrait photos, maybe for Instagram for example, then the TCL Stylus 5G will definitely get the job done. Next, we're going to take a look at the macro camera. Now, I'm not a huge fan of macro cameras to begin with. I feel like it's more of a niche feature and I just happen to not use it. Now, I'm not sure how many of you use a macro camera, but of course, whether or not you do, having more camera features is always better than having less. So let's take a look at what this macro camera can do. Here's a couple photos right here. I gotta say, I'm not overly impressed. I've definitely seen quite a bit better. And I'm not talking about flagship phones. In fact, lots of flagship phones don't even have macro cameras, but more mid-range phones like, for example, the Samsung Galaxy A33 5G, may be a little bit more expensive than this phone, but not too much, and that phone definitely takes significantly better macro photos. Overall, with this macro camera, you are still going to get decent close-up detailed images, but at the same time, it's really hazy, and this was taken in pretty decent lighting. So if you're taking photos for maybe a blog, for example, where you want it to look pretty professional, this phone is probably not going to be the best choice for that. But on the other hand, if you're just using the macro camera for the sake of using it, since after all, I guess it's kind of a cool feature to have, then this macro camera, while not being the best out there, is definitely not the worst either. Now we're going to take a look at the ultrawide camera. An ultrawide camera is a pretty common feature, but honestly they're kind of hit or miss in this price range. They can either be really good or really bad. I haven't found much of an in between, so let's see what the TCL Stylus 5G can do. So here are some photos taken with the ultrawide camera on this phone. Now I got 3 pictures here, and honestly only one of them is what I would consider even usable. The first 2 look pretty grainy and distorted, but then the last one actually looks decently good. Now this is mostly because of the lighting and angle. Remember, for all its good qualities, the TCL Stylus 5G really doesn't handle super high lighting very well, and these first 2 photos were taken in really high lighting, whereas the last photo was taken in a more reasonable setting. So again, when it comes to this rear camera setup, super bright lighting is the main limitation we're seeing here. And one kind of weird thing I want to point out about this phone is that with the ultrawide camera, for whatever reason, you can only take photos in 3x4 or 4x3. You're not actually able to use any other aspect ratio. Now that could just be me missing something, so let me know in the comments if I'm missing something super obvious and just not doing something right. But as you can see in my camera tips and tricks video, at least from what I can tell, you can only take ultrawide photos in 3x4 or 4x3, no other aspect ratios available. Now to wrap it all up, let's talk about videos. Now when it comes to videos, I'm really gonna let the quality speak for itself here, because depending on what you're actually recording videos for, some people might have higher standards than others. Another thing to keep in mind is that with this phone, the max recording quality is 1080p at 30 frames per second, so unfortunately we don't have any 4K here, and if you want to do something like a slow motion action video or get a smoother clip. Again, unfortunately, the max frame rate is 30 frames per second, so if you are trying to get those more professional looking high quality videos, that is something to think about. Now honestly, it's not really that surprising. The only phone in this price range, or at least general price range I can think of off the top of my head that has 4K videos would be the Samsung Galaxy A32 5G. Now of course, there are probably others, but the point is, in this price range, being able to record 4K videos, or even higher frame rates for that matter, aren't really that common, so this phone not having that ability isn't really that much of a disappointment. But without further ado, let's see what these videos look like.
Here's a test video with the TCL Stylus 5G. We are recording in 1080p right now, which is the max quality. Also keep in mind what the audio sounds like. Autofocus isn't the best, but for what it is pretty decent. So we're recording a video using the ultrawide camera with the TCL Stylus 5G. I actually forgot I could even do this. Does look pretty decent. Again, keep in mind what the audio sounds like.
So in conclusion, is the TCL Stylus 5G a good phone for mobile photography? In general, despite a lot of drawbacks, for what it is, I would personally say yes. Sure, the selfie camera, macro camera, and video quality in my opinion are pretty much subpar, especially for more professional use, and the ultrawide camera is a little questionable too, but with the main camera in portrait mode, honestly, I feel like these two features alone make this camera absolutely worth using, especially if you're just using it for stuff like social media, for example, where you want keepable, usable quality, but at the same time don't need like DSLR level, because remember, platforms like Instagram and Twitter do compress their images anyway, so if you have a super crazy high quality photo, it's not actually going to show up like that. So if that's really all you're taking photos for, then in most cases, the TCL Stylus 5G will absolutely get the job done. But this concludes my camera review of the TCL Stylus 5G. Again, in general, this is going to be nowhere near the level of a $1,400 flagship phone, for example, but for the mid-range phone that it is, I do think the camera is actually pretty good. But I hope you enjoyed this video and learned something new. If you did, don't forget to give it a thumbs up and hit that subscribe button, and be sure to follow the Kalipis Tech Twitter and Instagram. I'm finally starting to be active on those platforms after quite a while, so feel free to drop by. But that's it for this video. As always, I will see you in the next one.